In this lecture, we're going to talk about imports and exports. So far, all of our JavaScript was always in a single file. And that's okay for now. Until our code is not huge, we don't have to traverse the code between multiple files. But as soon as you start learning a framework or a library like Angular, Vue, React, or Node, your applications are going to get much larger and you will need to have multiple files. For that reason, let's see how we can use imports and exports in JavaScript. To do that, you can open the Explorer, and then in this folder we're currently in, let's create a new file. We're going to call this file dogs.js. It doesn't really matter how you call it, but let's do it like that for now. I'm going to collapse this, and now in there, let's create an array of dogs. Const dogs is equal to an array, and then let's put some dogs names like Bear, Fluffy, and let's do something like Doggo, just like that. Now, my question for you is, how would you get these dogs over to the script.js file? For example, let's say that you want to do something like this. Console.log, a template string, my dogs are, and now in here you want to list them. But we don't have access to the dogs array in the script.js file. So how can we get them from the dogs.js over to the script.js? To do that, I'm going to open the files side by side. You can drag and drop it here and then put it on the right side. That way, we're going to have our script.js on the left side and our dogs.js on the right side. Now, the only thing we have to do is export the dogs. So we can do something like this. Export default dogs. If you use this syntax, export default dogs, that's going to mean that we are trying to export the dogs array from the dogs file. And now, on top of the script.js file, you can do something like this. Import dogs from, and then we have to target our path. So that's going to be a string from dot slash. Dot slash means that the file is in the same folder as our current file. So you can see we are currently in the script.js and we want to take it from the dogs.js. So you can do it simply like this. Import dogs from dogs. To be able to do this, you first have to export dogs. So now what we can do, my dogs are, and then in here we can use the $sign and curly braces to show the dogs. And for this to work, there's only one more thing we have to do. You can open your files, head to the index.html file, and then in here, the only thing you have to add to your script is a type equal to module. If you add this, that's going to allow you to use the import-export syntax. Now, if we save that, we can go back, save the script file, and you can see my dogs are Bear, Fluffy, and Doggo. That's it. You successfully used JavaScript written in the file dogs.js inside of the file script.js. And I completely understand if you cannot see the purpose of this right now, but later on bigger applications, that's going to make our applications so much more scalable, which means that you will be able to add features without it being overwhelming or unorganized. Now, there's also something more to imports and exports. In this case, we use the export default syntax. Export default is used if there is only one thing that you want to export from one singular file. Now, the export from our dogs file is not going to be export default because we're going to add a second thing there. We're going to say something like this. Const number of dogs, and that's going to be equal to dogs.length, just like so. Now we have both dogs and number of dogs. So how can we export multiple things out of one file? Well, the simplest way is to simply add the export syntax just before the const. So you say export const dogs or export const number of dogs. And then, as you can see, we currently have an error in this file, but what you can do right now is if you have multiple files, you cannot do it simply like this. You have to add a curly brace right there, and then inside of there, you can specify those names. For example, dogs or number of dogs. Now we can say something like this, console log, and then I have number of dogs. So we're having two console logs. One says I have 3 dogs, and the other one says my dogs are, and then their names. So you can notice the difference. In here, we need to use curly braces and then specify the names of our imports. Just to reiterate, let's create one more file, which is going to be called test.js. So inside of our modern JavaScript folder, I'm going to create test.js, and inside of there, we want to have only one export. So that's going to be, let's call it only one thing. And that's going to be equal to test. So just to let you know, when you have only one thing that you want to export from one file, only in that case do you use the export default syntax. Only one thing. Now from test, we are exporting something using the export default, and from dogs, we are simply exporting them using export const. This allows you to export multiple things. Now, how are we going to import that only one thing from the test file? Well, we can say import only one thing. And that's going to be coming from /test.js, or you can simply say test. Now, to be sure that we properly imported that, let's just do console log, and then in there, I'll say only one thing. And there we have it. Test, I have 3 dogs, and my dogs are. One last thing to let you know is that if you have a default export, you can name it anything you like. For example, you don't have to name this only one thing, as we named it right here. You can name it, for example, the letter A, and it's still going to work. Why is that? Well, since there is only one export from that single file, it's always going to be the same thing, test. There is no need to have the same name because JavaScript always knows that that's that same thing. It's only one, singular. So we can name it anything you like. You can name it A, you can name it ABC, or you can simply name it how you exported it from there. Definitely the best practice is to simply call it as you called it right there. In this case, only one thing. This was the default import. On the other hand, while we're talking about named imports and exports, you have to call them exactly how you call them right there. You can see export const dogs or number of dogs. In here, if you did something like A, you're gonna get an error saying the requested module does not provide an export named A. You have to name it dogs exactly how you named it in the file where you exported it from. Great, that's all that there is to imports and exports. This is going to be extremely valuable to you once you start learning React.